I compared 40 player cards and hundreds of cards overall against the top 4 grading companies to come up with a defined list of sales price multipliers without opinion or sway, just pure math. I also used a 45-day window to keep things consistent, and I took data from multiple platforms. Every possible place there was public data or an API that I could pull from, I did so. Each one of these slides is broken down by sport. At the end, I broke it down in totality. Stick around for that treasure trove. So here's the baseball slide. As you can see, 10 players on there. You got your Judges, Otanis, Machados, Tatitas, Francos. Now, I know people are going to say, well, Tatis, he was a lot more expensive. The PED thing is down. It doesn't matter. All irrelevant to what I'm trying to do. Again, think of this 45-day window. That's all we're talking about here. So it's how much did his card sell for in this 45-day window. I could care less what his card sold for 2 years ago. For this exercise, for differentiating grading level values across companies, doesn't matter. Now, it is a little tough to read this, but as you can see, you've got your BGS 10 and BGS 10 black labels on here, but there wasn't enough data to actually use in the overall because of the way everything broke down. This is a more visual representation of it. As you can see, all the way on the left is your PSA 10. And then you've got your, as you can see, you can kind of see your staging, right? You have your PSA 10s, then you have your SGC 10s next highest over, BGS, CSG. PSA 9 below. As you can see, the 9.5s for SGC tend to sell in baseball more than a PSA 9. The interesting one is where the CSG 9 came in above a BGS 9 and above, well, frankly, above all the 9s. I found that extremely interesting and completely unexpected. Guys, a more visual representation from baseball perspective, so I made this, and you got your tier breakdown. It's pretty easy to look at. Your SGC 10, BGS 9.5, CSG 10. You're all sitting up there. You've got your regular multiples, so not too overall surprising. But when you look at this, SGC 10, 30% less than PSA 10, about going in what I expected. Then you're down to 40, 45% for the other two. Then you have a fairly substantial drop from those 10s down to 9.5s and 9s. I find it really interesting that if you try to send a card into SGC and it comes back at 9, it's completely worthless. I mean, from this perspective, baseball, 21% of a PSA 10, that's raw, so I wouldn't even, something to think about anyway when you are debating bringing that stuff in. See the breakdown of these 10. Again, this is basketball this time around. So now we've got your LeBrons, your Trays, your Anthony Edwards. The same rules apply, 45-day window. So again, I don't care what the car sold for 6 months ago. I don't care what it sells for 6 months from now. You didn't have many BGS 10 or BGS 10 black labels for any of these. In fact, you only had one black label, which I found interesting, was a Tatum, and it was a $4,500 card. Whew, that was black labels, man, I tell you. All right. And again, as you look at all of these, same rules apply. So when you look at the breakdown by grade, as you can see, PSA 10 stands well above and beyond everything else. Your SGCs are higher, then you've got your more traditional, then BGS, and then CSG, right? And if you look at your 9s across the board, it's a little bit different in this breakdown, but for the most part, pretty standard. But the big thing here for me is there seems to be a larger gap for a PSA 10 to everything else in this sport. I wanted to make it more visual for basketball. So here we go. Same general idea again. PSA 10, SGC 10s, but it's a 40% differential more so than it was for baseball, which was 30%, right? Your BGS, CSG still kind of fall in line around the same general area. The gap is a little bit smaller in basketball between CSG 10s and then say an SGC 9.5. But still, the overall rundown, and you'll get some flipping as you look down through this line. SGC 9s overtook CSG 9s. So that was kind of interesting, but it's really the bottom of the barrel when you're going from a grading perspective. And again, I avoided 8s and below. I don't care. I'm not putting them on the slide. That's not what we're trying to figure out multiples for at a show. Same players, as you can see. We're not going to go through every name on here, but you got all your who's, right, breaking down on here. I did try to have a little bit of fun with this when going across, so I went and pulled an 03 Topps Chrome Brady, because why not? Very little BGS 10 or black label movement at all. In fact, there was just one. So how do these correlate to prices? As you can see, you have your PSA 10s, king of the world, again, not surprising. Your SGC 10s, a little closer, than they were in basketball. BGS stronger comparatively. here, and then your CSGs below that. As you can see, you have your SGC 95s are standing tall and above, but overall, the gaps are pretty standard. Again, same rule of thumb as we did earlier with some of the other visual depictions. Your PSA 10, still king, right? Still control. Nothing is really changing there. Your SGC still about 30%, really more like 27% when it comes to football. So that gap is closing, especially compared to previous years. BGS is falling farther behind from a football perspective in SGC 10. CSG, you're still living at 50%, man, of a PSA 10. It's not really closing much ground. Then at the back end, you've got pretty standard SGC 9.5, PSA 9, BGS, CSG, SGC. Those nines will flip around from time to time, but they're all somewhere between 20 and 17%. And at some point in time, I have to draw the line somewhere, and I focused more on the bigger 3 than I did on the 5 overall. But as you can see in here, I did pull out 5 players. Again, still more than 100 cards broken down in here, but Holland, Mbappe, Pulisic, Saka, some pretty straightforward ones. But again, this was a little challenging as well with some of the newer guys to try to find stuff across all products, right? A couple of BGS 10s to point out. You had an Mbappe BGS 10, sorry, that was like a $750 card. And then, interesting enough, you had a Pulisic that was a black label, and that exponentially. I mean, look at that, $1,135 is what that one sold for. By comparison, the PSA 10 was 133. I mean, it's like, what, 11x? Wow. If you want a more visual representation of how this breaks down, I found this one interesting. In the soccer perspective, as you can see, PSA 10 is still by far king, but the gap is smaller for SGC, and CSG overtook BGS here. But if you look at the gap in the 10s down to the not 10s, it's wider here, which I found very interesting. Visually, PSN control again. You got your SGC 95, CSG. Now, okay, here is another one that I found really interesting. I don't know why I found it so interesting, but in some of the other bigger sports, right, you had, remember we were talking about, you had 40%, 30%. The SGC 95, so on and so forth, are kind of rocking about the same. You know, so no massive changes there. Doesn't matter what I thought. This word it. Not leaving anybody out. Hockey. Pretty standard people here. Caulfield, McDavid, et cetera, et cetera. Again, 5 players. There were only 2 BGS 10, no black labels in this 45-day window. One McDavid, you know, it $4,758, but the gap over a PSA 10 wasn't as big. And then you had a BGS 10 Young Guns for Alexis, you know, and it was, you know, substantial. I didn't expect this. I didn't expect this at all. PSA 10 is still king, but look who's number 2. CSGs. Then you drop down to SGC and then drop down to BGS from there. I thought that was really unexpected. I was confident going into this. I didn't know what the multiples would be, but that PSA 10s would be top, SGC 10s would be 2, BGS 95s 3, CSG 10s 4. And nope, that is not how it played out. So I found this extremely interesting. Very, very interesting. All right, folks, now based on that, as you can see, we have the breakdown for hockey. And this was our curveball. This was the big, unequivocal curveball. PSA 10 still on top. Look at that. CSG 10s, 76, 25% from a PSA 10. 25. And comfortably above an SGC 10 and a BGS 9.5. Million years. Never would have seen that coming. Now, it didn't correlate to the CSG 9s down below. As you can see, they're still living at the bottom of the barrel between those 3, flipping around. But also in hockey, your PSA 9s jumped over the SGC 9.5s. So found that all pretty interesting. Was never going in thinking there was going to be a CSG 10 ever that was 25% off of the PSA 10. Kind of makes you wonder, you know, if things starting to change a little bit, or is hockey an anomaly and if they just prefer that slab. Finally! Here it is, what you've been waiting for. All 5 sports, all 40 players, all hundreds and hundreds of cards combined into one overall breakdown. Here we go. Here's the breakdown with them all correlated together. All 5 sports rolled into one. Super interesting, right? No, not really. Aside from the anomaly in hockey, things pretty much hold true and what you'd expect them to be. SGC 10s live about 30% less than a PSA 10 as a control. CSG 10s and BGS 95s, call it 40%. So SGC is starting to pull ahead of the other two. Then there's a massive drop down to your PSA 9s, 35% of a PSA 10. And so if you go through most of them, it's pretty easy to correlate a PSA 9, SGC 95. They're basically about the same price. I mean, there will be a gap depending on sport, but if you're roughshotting at a show, I think that's a very, very fair assumption. I think an also fair assumption is BGS 9, CSG 9, SGC 9, just group them all the same. You know, consider those to be 20 to 25% of a PSA 10. Consider your PSA 9s and SGC 95s to be in the 30 to 40% of a PSA 10. I think that's fair. And then if you look at everything else, you're about 30% to 40%. The big thing again for me, 30% for SGC 95, CSG, and BGS 95, basically 40%. Feel free to screenshot this, save it, whatever you want to do. Again, I didn't necessarily expect to get the result I got, but it is what it is. Get mad at it, disagree with it, leave a comment below about that. At the end of the day, I don't care. Math doesn't lie. It's perception and reality. These are reality.